Welcome in everyone again. So now we are going to be doing another deck breakdown, and today we're going to be talking about a weird one. This one is RaggaDragga, Gore Guts Boss. This is a little bit strange. I would definitely not call this a meta deck, not in the slightest. This is just something that I've come up with after looking at different deck lists and looking at EDH Rec and trying to piece some monstrosity together that I've put together here. Number one, why would you even want to play RaggaDragga? Well, if you go to my Moxfield list, that's going to be in the description, I have titled it, I Hate Bowmaster the Deck. I mainly built this because I was sick and tired of my mana dorks dying to Bowmaster, and RaggaDragga prevents that. So let's read RaggaDragga. It is a legendary creature, human boar. Each creature you control with a mana ability gets +2/+2. Whenever a creature you control with a mana ability attacks, you untap it. So essentially giving your mana dorks pseudo-vigilance. Whenever you cast a spell, if at least 7 mana was spent to cast it, untap a target creature. It gets +7/+7 and gains trample until end of turn. So when you have RaggaDragga on board, when you have something like your Fyndhorn Elves, your Birds, your Llanowar, your Elvish, or your Delighted Halflings, these are all either 3/3s, 2/3s. In Delighted Halfling case, it is a 3/4 all of a sudden. A lot more difficult to kill than your standard mana dork that is sitting at 1/1. But what is this deck mainly trying to do? Is mainly creature combo. I say creature combo, but really the way you're ending up winning the game is through combat damage. Most of the time, you're just going to be trying to be very aggressive. You're going to be swinging in, letting your dorks have their vigilance, and asking people if they're going to block or not your 3/3 or your 5/5 or your 6/6, depending on which ones you have in play. What are some of the most powerful pieces in RaggaDragga to use? The number one creatures that I personally love in RaggaDragga, and these are part of some of the enablers that we have, are things like Cradle Clearcutter, Viridian Joiner, Marwyn the Nurturer, Heronblade Elite, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, and Kami of Whispered Hopes. So what do all of these cards have in common? All of these simply state that they tap for the amount of power they have, not the amount that they're just down for. They're not a normal mana dork that simply taps for 1. In the case of these 3 on the left, very importantly, these tap for any mana of color, whereas these ones are a little bit more restrictive, and that'll come up in some combos that we're going to talk about. These 3 are kind of your main go-tos when you're looking for a power dork, mainly Heronblade Elite. The reason that Heronblade Elite is probably the best of our power dorks is typically you want your Heronblade Elite out on turn 2, and RaggaDragga actually will trigger Heronblade Elite to not only get a pump from RaggaDragga +2/+2, but will also get a +1/+1 counter from a human entering the battlefield. So the moment RaggaDragga comes down on turn 3, Heronblade Elite automatically taps for 4 mana of any one color, whether it's red or green in this list. Let's talk about what we do and how we get there and what some of our outlets are going to be. I mean, it pretty much is Man Bear Pig. It pretty much is. It's pretty much Man Bear Pig. Heronblade Elite is definitely the best in this freaking list, man. The fact that RaggaDragga triggers it, so it makes it a 4/4 when it comes down, that's nuts. It's nuts, dude. Automatically taps for 4. I could just put my Temur Sabertooth down if I already had it, just because it's down, just because it's there and exists. Some of the easiest ways to make infinite mana with RaggaDragga are going to be with these main 2 cards right here, and this can also equate to a win con, depending on the circumstances. And also, you're going to usually want another one of your mana dorks. Maybe you have another power dork on the battlefield. But this deck is crazy good at making mana, so it's not unheard of that you're going to make a ton of mana and have a bunch of creatures on board. You're also a Gaia's Cradle deck. One of the main enablers is going to be Umbral Mantle. So Umbral Mantle, for those that don't know, an equipped creature has 3, you untap it, and the creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. For instance, in the case of Heronblade Elite, if RaggaDragga was to come down afterwards, now taps for 4. You can tap the Heronblade Elite for 4 mana, cast the Umbral Mantle, you have 1 mana floating, You can equip it for 0. And Viridian Joiner, if it was not pumped by any means and it's just RaggaDragga, you now have 3 mana through the Viridian Joiner to help activate the Heron Blade, which now untaps, gets +2/+2, which means it now taps for 6 mana. So you simply tap the Heron Blade Elite for 6, untap it for 3, and then it taps for 8. This now makes infinite mana. On top of that, if you happen to have a ton of creatures on board, maybe your opponents don't have a lot of things on board and all of these creatures have been out for a turn, you've given them haste through some kind of effect, which there is at least one card that gives haste that I'll talk about. You can then actually move the Umbral Mantle around and just infinitely untap and tap them as well, even though these ones won't, well, the Viridian Joiner will give you infinite mana, but these ones won't. But the main point is that you'll pump them infinitely, and you can actually just swing out and kill them with something like Umbral Mantle if there's not a lot of creatures on board. Doesn't exactly give a way to get through, but still an infinite mana enabler and also a quote-unquote win con. The other one that goes alongside of Umbral Mantle is Aggravated Assault. So, again, in the instance of Aggravated Assault, if this was to be your board state, you can tap the Heron Blade Elite for 4 red, since Heron Blade Elite can tap for a mana of any one color, and then you can tap the Viridian Joiner for 3 green. Use 4 of the red and 1 of the green from Viridian Joiner to activate Aggravated Assault. You untap all creatures you control, and if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. So notice, though, we had some extra green left over. So we tap them all again for making 7 mana, and only taking 5 of that to untap all of our creatures and continue to tap them. Obviously, you'd be tapping the Elvish Mystic as well, but you would essentially have infinite combat steps. Now, again, much like Umbral Mantle, there's no way of getting through to your opponents, so you just either A, have to be lucky and they're not quite on the board yet, and you have enough to swing through, or you simply just put a clock on people. You tell them, I'm swinging at you with infinite, creatures as far as like swinging in and taking infinite combat steps. But if your things are big enough, Aggravated Assault, again, is just another win con. Let's talk about the ones that are a little bit better than that. Things that actually are going to win the game for you. Once you've made infinite mana through either Aggravated Assault or Umbral Mantle, you're going to cast something as simple as a Walking Ballista. Everyone knows Walking Ballista. You can cast it for a million, X is a million, right? After you've used your Umbral Mantle or your Aggravated Assault, pull the counters off, kill everyone. But another one of my favorites in this list is going to be Song of Totentons. Is an X cost spell that creates X 1/1 black rat creature tokens with this creature can't block, and creatures you control get haste until end of turn. This was the haste enabler that I was talking about earlier. So not only is this a win con once you've made infinite mana because you make infinite rats, but it is also a haste enabler for 1 red. You won't make any rats, but you can make everything haste and tap immediately. All right, so we talked about some of the ways to make infinite mana and some of the easy infinite mana outlets. But RaggaDragga has another ability. It has the ability to pump things +7/+7. So how are we going to utilize that? What is the reason RaggaDragga does this? Why is it actually good? A couple things that I want to point out are things like your big mana enablers that we would typically see in something that is low color. Something like Turn Timber Symbiosis. You look at the top 7 cards of your library, you may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield. If that card has converted mana cost 3 or less, it enters with 3 additional counters on it, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you were to have something like our favorite, Heron Blade Elite, on the battlefield when you cast something like this, say you used your Heron Blade Elite to attack this, right? We'll tap the Heron Blade Elite for 4 mana if RaggaDragga was to come down after Heron Blade Elite. And then we'll use 3 among other mana dorks for our lands. We cast the Turn Timber Symbiosis. That will trigger RaggaDragga. That will untap the Heron Blade Elite and give it +7/+7. Heron Blade Elite now taps for 11 mana. That's why I said this is quite a big mana deck. So say we were to resolve the Turn Timber Symbiosis. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Just as a curiosity, we'll see what we can find. We found a Priest of Titania and a Collector Oof, in case we wanted to do something like that. But it's an enabler, right? It is something that we would use mainly as a land, but if it's late game and you have the mana, and maybe you hit something really good off of it. Another enabler that I personally really enjoy in low color decks like this, especially in something like RaggaDragga, is a Last March of the Ents. So Last March of the Ents cannot be countered. You draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, and then put any numbers of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, the reason I love Last March of the Ents in this list is RaggaDragga's trigger resolves first before Last March of the Ents. With this on the stack, casting it, RaggaDragga will trigger, which will untap your Heronblade Elite, and it now is an 11/11. So Last March of the Ents will see an 11 power or 11 toughness creature on the board. You will draw 11 cards from the top of your library and put any number of creatures onto the battlefield. One of my favorites in this list, not seen a lot, but it is definitely one of the ones that works really, really well. In a normal hand, when I'm looking at the beginning of the game, typically I want one of these power dorks. It's not always going to be Heronblade Elite. It's not always going to be your favorite, right? Let's say we have something like a Viridian Joiner instead. The other thing I'm going to be looking for is one of our mana dorks, right? Delighted Halfling, Finhorn, Birds of Paradise, Llanowar, Elvish Mystic, right? We'll say it's tried and true Birds of Paradise in our opening hand, okay? And we'll say that luck was not on our side, and outside of this, we only drew one other card that wasn't a land, right? Put out the birds turn 1, turn out the Viridian Joiner on turn 2. We'll say RaggaDragga came down on turn 3. And the one other card that we pulled was one of our search spells, and then specifically one of our big mana cost search spells. So you have things like Finale of Devastation. You have things like Court of Calling. This one you have to be a little bit careful of, because if you do use Convoke, it does not count towards the mana cost of RaggaDragga, so just be careful with that. You have things like Tooth and Nail, which is a card, again, not super seen in some of your higher mana color decks, but in a deck like this that cares about the 7 mana cost, Tooth and Nail is a great piece. Something like Green Sun Zenith, or even Invasion of Ikoria. So for this example, we'll simply say that Finale of Devastation was the one non-land that we drew, and we're going into our turn 4. So this is one of the main combos that I have in the list, and typically turn 4 is where we're going to want to win. Chances of us winning earlier, not super relevant. There are chances, obviously. We could draw a ton of mana and have just these things out really, really early, but this is more of a mid-range deck. You would consider it maybe a little bit parasitic. I don't run a ton of interaction. I don't run a ton of ways to stop people. I could tune my list, or you could look at my list and tune it yourself to your own pods if you'd like. Regardless, we'll talk about this line. So in this board state, we'll say that this is turn 4. So we will tap 4 mana. We'll tap the Viridian Joiner for 3 because RaggaDragga is on the battlefield. And we will cast Finale of Devastation where X equals 5. That will cause RaggaDragga to trigger. You will target Viridian Joiner. You will untap the Viridian Joiner, and he now taps for 10 mana. Before priority is taken from you, tap the Viridian Joiner for that 10 green mana. If your Finale of Devastation resolves, you will put it into the yard. And here's, I would say, my pride and joy of the list, I guess you could say. I don't know. It's just a fun card that I like to use. Rules lawyers out there, I'm so sorry that I use this card, but I love it. So Finale of Devastation will resolve. You'll begin searching, but as you are searching, you will cast Panglacial Worm from your library. Specifically, Panglacial Worm is 7 mana, so you will use 10. You have 10 mana from the Viridian Joiner. You will use 7 of it to cast the Panglacial Worm while resolving your Finale of Devastation. That will cause RaggaDragga to trigger again. You will untap your Viridian Joiner again, and it will now tap for 17 mana. Another just quick thing just to let people know, when you are searching and you do cast something like Panglacial Worm, just make sure that you keep track of where the top of your library was when you were searching, because if someone does decide to interact, maybe make you draw a card of some kind, this is still the top of your library as you're searching. Do not change it, because that can cause a lot of rules problems. But regardless, we'll cast the Panglacial Worm as we're searching, and then we will continue to resolve the Finale of Devastation, right? And the Finale of Devastation will find us Temur Sabertooth. So Temur Sabertooth used to be a big dockside enabler, but I found use for it in this list. So Viridian Joiner now taps for 17 mana. So you will tap the Viridian Joiner for 17 mana. You will activate Temur Sabertooth's ability, and you will bounce the Panglacial Worm back to your hand. You will then use some of the excess mana that you have, because you have a crazy amount at this point. You'll recast the Panglacial Worm. You will have a RaggaDragga trigger. You will untap Viridian Joiner. It now taps for an additional 7 mana. You will repeat this loop infinitely. You will make infinite green mana specifically, but the main purpose of this is once you've made Viridian Joiner make infinite mana, you will then bounce it and you'll target your Birds of Paradise. And then you'll bounce it and target your Birds of Paradise again. You will do this 100 times, and then you'll do the exact same thing with RaggaDragga. And even though Temur Sabertooth and Panglacial Worm do not have haste, it does not matter. Viridian Joiner is now infinitely huge, Birds of Paradise is infinitely huge, and RaggaDragga is infinitely huge, and they all have trample. 1 to one opponent, 1 to another opponent, and 1 to another opponent. What happens if we don't have Panglacial Worm? What are some of our other enablers that we can use outside of Panglacial Worm, even though this is 100% the best one for me? So we will look at some other enablers that we have. Something like Regal Force. Regal Force, whenever it enters, you draw cards equal to each green creature you have. Now, this one obviously is a little bit dangerous because you can attempt to accidentally draw yourself out of the game, but usually you'll find another one of the enablers so you do not deck yourself. But a Regal Force is another 7 mana piece that will not only draw you a ton of cards, but it will also pump a creature, which then will allow you to cast all of these cards that you're drawing. Another fun one is Moloch. So Moloch has Ravenous. Creature enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. If X is 5 or more, you draw a card when it enters. So this is another way when you have this Temur Sabertooth loop that you can actually draw your entire deck as well. Also, when it enters the battlefield, you actually fight as well. And because it will be a 7/7 when it enters, chances are there's not going to be a lot on the field that will stop you from killing it. And when it dies, it actually goes to exile rather than dying, which is a great just removal piece in general. So you don't need to cast this for X = 5 every single time. But in the case of this, you absolutely would. And then the last enabler, which is a fun casual staple, is going to be Craterhoof Behemoth. Now, Craterhoof Behemoth is also really fun in the instance of something like this, because Craterhoof enters, gives all creatures haste, and they gain trample and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. In the case of having Temur Sabertooth on the battlefield and casting the Craterhoof Behemoth, say it's from your hand, you will cast the Craterhoof Behemoth. Say you use the Viridian Joiner to cast it. You cast the Craterhoof. There will be a trigger on RaggaDragga. You will untap the Viridian Joiner. And so the Viridian Joiner will now tap for 10. Here's the fun part. When Craterhoof enters, it gives all creatures +X/+X and trample. So for this instance, each one of our creatures is going to get +5/+5, which means the Viridian Joiner now actually taps for 15 mana. So you will tap it for 15 mana, use 2 of it to bounce the Craterhoof back to your hand, and then you will use all of that mana to recast the Craterhoof. It will untap, gain +7/+7 from RaggaDragga, and everything will get pumped +5/+5 again and have haste. So there's no reason to cast it too much because everything's getting pumped every single time. You don't need to continue to retarget RaggaDragga or Birds of Paradise. Another couple honorable mentions that I like to shout out in a list like this. So with Panglacial Worm specifically, we can one-shot an opponent that we are scared of. And the way that we use this is through our lands. So I do have the Phyrexian one, but this is Inkmoth Nexus. So Inkmoth Nexus is a land that can be turned into a creature for a single mana. So because of RaggaDragga and the way that he is worded, this is a land, this is a creature with a mana ability. So you now have a creature that is a 3/3 infect creature. Now, say you needed to take someone out because you knew they had a counter spell, right? Maybe they're the only blue person at the pod. I don't know, right? So say you have enough mana between a power dork or something, and you have a fetch land, and you haven't fetched first. You make your Inkmoth Nexus a creature until end of turn, and here's what's really fun in case maybe they have a Ristic Study as well, right? A way to pay for it, okay? So you'll move to combat, you'll swing with the birds, you'll swing with the Inkmoth Nexus, and the fun thing with Heronblade Elite, which is another reason why Heronblade Elite is my favorite, you'll swing with the Heronblade Elite, it has Vigilance. You'll respond to the RaggaDragga trigger by tapping it for 4, and then it will resolve, untapping all of your mana creatures. You'll then tap the Heronblade Elite for an additional 4 mana, so you'll have 8 in your mana pool. If they declare no blocks from the Inkmoth Nexus, you will simply sack your Wooded Foothills in response to that, and you will cast the Panglacial Worm from your library. And obviously, because Panglacial Worm is 7 and you made 8 mana, you can pay for a Ristic Study or something like that if you needed to. You'll target the Inkmoth Nexus. It will get +7/+7 until end of turn and hit them with 10/10 infect and kill them immediately. Just another one that I like to shout out in the list. One last shout out that I want to do for RaggaDragga specifically. It's a card that came out recently. It doesn't really like do anything crazy for the deck, but I do find it a very interesting card just because it essentially gives all creatures in our deck essentially vigilance, and that is Enduring Vitality. So the other thing that Enduring Vitality does for us is it makes RaggaDragga a 6/6, essentially, with Vigilance. This allows us to do some fun things with mana, but it was just a card that I wanted to shout out, and even if it dies, it comes back as an enchantment and still pumps all of our creatures, even though they're technically not mana dorks because of RaggaDragga. So, why would you play RaggaDragga? Honestly, I don't know. In all seriousness, RaggaDragga is a really, really fun big mana deck. If you really enjoy big mana, blowing people out of nowhere because they have no idea that a Panglacial Worm is going to come down, whether it's in the middle of combat or whether or not you're doing it to go for the win in a game, it is an incredibly fun experience to cast some of these big mana things that you typically see in casual games, that you would typically see not played in CEDH. And that's one of my biggest things with RaggaDragga is it's not the most competitive thing in the world. Would I take it to a tournament? Probably not. But for me, it's way more about the fun of the deck, how it interacts, how it wins, and how it can kill people way more than anything else. For me personally, if you just love big mana beatdown, RaggaDragga is 100% the deck for you. I think that's just about going to do it. If there's any other combos or any things that you guys want to suggest for the deck, maybe some big mana spells that I didn't maybe catch on, or maybe some combos that I'm not aware of, maybe some ways to get evasion in the deck that might have some fun synergies, I'd love to hear about them. So thank you guys so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you guys want to keep continuing to see little deck breakdowns like this, and there's going to be more on the way. So thank you guys. Have a good one.